All right, so chapter 3 covers ethical and scientific guidelines for social work research. I'm glad that the chapter devotes, or the textbook devotes a full chapter to ethics. You'll see a bunch of interesting cases in the discussion section and what we're going to be covering in this chapter. I think it's really important to really have an idea of what people have done wrong in the past so that we don't repeat ourselves. So I posted a video of Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments to the website. So I'd encourage you to look through that and decide what you think, if it was ethical, if it was unethical, and what was unethical about it, without giving away the whole idea of the study, which you'll be able to see online. Basically, here, the question lies with the informed consent and what people signed up for and what they thought they were signing up for and really what was happening. It's an interesting case because we learned about the role of deception and whether there actually was harm to the participants. They believe they were inflicting harm on others, but ultimately, I think the question for me watching the study is whether or not what we learned about obedience and the strength of people's responsiveness to authority figures, the role of that, and particularly how it was related to perceived authority during World War II and how the atrocities of the Holocaust could have happened. So interesting study, and I'd encourage you to watch the video and post to the discussion section. So anytime we're conducting research on people, somebody has to think about the standpoint of the people or the subjects of the research, because we want to make sure that we're benefiting people who we're studying, and not that we're just taking data from them or that we're using it to further our research or to further our profession, rather. There's the Havasupai example that I posted online. You'll learn more about HeLa cells as well. A few different ethical considerations where people might have only really had a narrow vision on what they're hoping to achieve, but not really taking a step back to look at how they're really benefiting their participants. Should be super obvious, but having a strong ethical code doesn't ensure ethical practice. That's why we have credentialing boards and people who review these things, because even if there's an ethical code, that can help us to do reprimands after the fact, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people are ethical practitioners beforehand. And I think it's also important to think about the difference between ethics and morals too, because ethics I view as the very minimum standard of practice that we have to follow for our profession, versus moral should be what we aspire to, which I view as more of what's the purpose of all of this that we're doing, and are we really giving back, and are we really benefiting society by the work that we do? So another thing that I'd encourage you to think about as you look at some of the research projects or the research that we were presented in this course. So just a historical comment here based on Nazi experiments and the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which you should read more about. Again, more posted online about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which was really severed trust of a community that researchers intended to prosper off of. And in this case, it actually led to premature death of the participants. So this resulted in the National Commission for Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. And as you'll read about in your text with the Belmont report, three big components here are respect for persons and their autonomy, beneficence, and really looking at whether or not the research that we're doing is actually beneficial to the field of social work and society as a whole and the participants who are in the study, and also a strong social justice component. So I always think about beneficence and non-malfeasance. So we don't want to damage people who are, or populations that we're working with, which has been done in time, obviously. But we also want to make sure that we're benefiting and giving back to whoever we're working with. In this day and age, now institutional review boards, or IRBs, spend a lot of time making sure that before any study gets the thumbs up, that the benefits are going to outweigh the risks. So with any study, there's some foreseeable risk besides maybe survey study or looking at post hoc study or something along those lines. But most social science studies have, like, albeit minimum, some possibility of risk. And we have to look at whether that risk really outweighs the benefit. So it might not be the risk in a way like a pharmaceutical trial might cause risk to somebody's health, but potentially even asking a questionnaire about somebody's trauma history or sexual experience or whatever it may be could potentially cause some psychological distress to that person. So we have to look at whether or not our study and what we're trying to investigate is really going to provide more benefit than actually risk or potential harm to the participant. So the Federal Policy for Protection of Human Subjects, University Institutional Review Board, again IRB, apply ethical standards set by federal regulations, but can also be set by the university. Sometimes it's set by hospitals too. So I work at the VA hospital. We have an IRB there. I've worked at a couple other hospitals where there's an institutional review board. And again, the purpose of this being is, universities and hospitals want to encourage research, but we need to make sure that somebody's regulating that and that the research that's being done is actually helping to progress the science in that field and professional practice and not really doing any harm. Or at least minimizing any potential causes or risks for harm. And along with that is coming up with informed consent so that people know what they're signing up for. So as some of you may already know, hopefully you've heard this by now, but the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics includes protecting research participants. Again, before anybody goes out and conducts any kind of research, it needs to be approved by an IRB. And really should be consulting with other professionals in their field too in a research proposal to make sure that what they're doing is benefiting the population that they're working with and also minimizing risk. Honesty and openness, again, that comes with informed consent, so people need to know what they're signing up for. I think it's always a good idea when completing informed consent to ask for the participants' understanding of what you've just told them, because a lot of times people might just say, yes, I understand, and sign the line. But if you ask them to repeat it back, they might give you a completely different story than what you just explained to them. Also, achieving valid results. As we talked about in Chapter 2, validity is making sure that we're measuring what we intend to measure and that those results are reported accurately as such. And also the NASW talks about the use of research and that it's used for, and also the use of research and that it's used for benefiting society as a whole. So to break down protecting research participants, obviously you want to avoid harm as much as possible. There are differing definitions of harm, and as you watch the Milgram video, you might question, was there harm here? Was there not harm? A lot of the participants said that they didn't feel that there was harm, so something to think about. Informed consent is making sure that the individual agrees to participate and they know what to expect. They know the pros and cons, and all this stuff should be explicitly described to them in terms that they can understand. But if you're working with somebody who's under the age of 18 or somebody who might be cognitively impaired, such as elderly, people with developmental disorders, you might also want to talk about getting assent. So client assent means that somebody who isn't the age of majority yet, but in a way that they can still make decisions but have some kind of cognitive impairment or not able to make independent choices, should complete assent, which is similar to informed consent, but you would still need both. So you would need a consenting adult, for instance, to fill out informed consent, but then maybe an adolescent would need to fill out assent, just meaning that they agree to the study, but assent doesn't hold up in legal court. So maintaining privacy and confidentiality, how are you going to store records? How are you going to make sure that it's de-identified to the point that somebody's personal information and all their responses to surveys and questionnaires aren't going to be accessible to people who don't need to be accessing them? So I think this is just an interesting question here. Does it mean that the subject should not be harmed psychologically or physically at all? That they should feel no anxiety or distress whatsoever during a study or only after involvement ends? These are all important questions to ask. I mean, I recently agreed to a study, which was just a questionnaire study about a procedure that my daughter had done, and feedback about experiences that we noticed. And as I completed the form, maybe there was like some distressing questions or maybe questions that I felt uncomfortable with and like I could skip. But I could say that it could cause me like a little bit of anxiety answering some questions. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be asking me them, but certainly I should have the right to not answer questions if I don't want to. Or my coworker, who's a psychiatrist, who's my office mate, they're conducting research on new psychotropic medications, and they can almost predict with some certainty that there's going to be a small percentage of people who don't react well to this new medication. But at the same time, if they don't move forward with creating and developing new medications, then we're not really going to make any kind of progress in the field of psychotropic medication management for mood stability or psychotic symptoms. So in that realm, it can become a little bit more murky. And you might feel a tug between wanting to progress the science and progress services, but also not wanting to do harm. So that's why these things cause such good debates and discussions. So in obtaining informed consent, probably some of you have already done informed consent. Even for clinical work, you should be getting informed consent. But as far as research goes, consent must be in linguistic level of a participant. So again, I talked about assent a little bit ago. If you're going to be doing kind of research with a college student or something, you assume a certain level of reading and IQ, versus if you're doing some kind of research with a high school student, you might have to write it in more of a language that they can understand. Or I personally work in some rural areas of Illinois where people's reading level is a little bit lower. So I might have to give them informed consent in more of a language that they can understand. Informed consent, you should also be honest about your research motivations, affiliation, potential conflict of interest. If you're getting paid to do a certain study, or if there's any kind of secondary gain, the people who are participating should know about that. Also, you should be clear on confidentiality procedures, what you're going to be doing to protect their information and protect their personal data, making sure that things are stored properly and in a locked area, and giving potential participants a choice to withdraw if you want. And I would say that informed consent is an ongoing process. So if somebody gives consent to start participating in a study, and then as they participate, they change their mind, they have the full right to withdraw. I can think of studies that I've been involved in where somebody said that they would be happy to participate, got a few minutes in, said it wasn't for them, and then just withdrew, and then that's fine. So I would say it's also important to keep in mind that informed consent is a process and not like a one-stop thing. So in maintaining privacy and confidentiality, it's important to keep in mind professional guidelines for like HIPAA, and ensuring that you've taken necessary information to de-identify information, to store it properly, to transmit it properly if you need to. So for instance, if you are going to be storing something on a cloud or online, that it's password protected, even if it's stored in an Excel spreadsheet, that there's a password protection on there. So making sure that you've got the different levels of protection that you need to be HIPAA compliant. So this is just a consideration that, a lot of people think that they should only publish papers if there's a statistically significant finding. But publication allows other people to critique your methods, and even if there isn't significant findings, still by putting it in the public eye, it's good for people to know if there wasn't if the hypotheses weren't met. Same with methods, and results should be published honestly and completely. I know, for instance, there's been papers that I've published and I've been hoping to prove correlations between different variables, and there wasn't, and my theory wasn't as sound as I'd hoped it would be. But still, by publishing that, people are allowed to see it and critique it and give me feedback. It is what it was at the end of the day, but it's still important for other professionals in the field to know that maybe an intervention that I put together wasn't as effective as I was hoping it to be. And the last point here is with conflict of interest, researchers that have significant financial stake in design or outcomes of research could lead them to change the results for personal gain. You can think of like a landmark example is there was researchers not too long ago that were paid, I believe, by the sugar industry to report that fats were what was causing obesity, when in the lab the results really showed that sugar was causing obesity and not fats. So there was a big push to get rid of high fat content in dairy products, which ultimately was shown that some of the researchers were taking money from people in the sugar industry, when we can really see that sugar is probably more closely associated with obesity than fats from dairy or meat products. So in looking at institutional review boards, when people are proposing a study, there's a few different statuses. Exempt status might be something where there's such low risk, such as like, I don't know, looking at data that's already been collected and reanalyzing it. Also expedited status, where there's also informed consent is required, maybe like through survey data, but not something like a full committee review, which could be for a high risk population. So I mentioned that I worked in an adolescent inpatient psychiatric unit, which is a very high risk population. So I had a full committee review that took over a year, with meeting with multiple review boards and professionals in the field and talking about any potential risks or side effects. And it went on for a really long time, which was good. It's good to make sure that population is protected, much more so than it would be in an expedited review, where maybe it came down to a vote or like a review of the proposal without like a full meeting face to face. So just some things to think about with internet research, which is becoming a lot more frequent. I think it's important to consider public and private space. So with IP addresses and being able to track down, who said what and where they said it, confidentiality is a lot harder to maintain and prove. So you might say that something's confidential or HIPAA compliant, but as you've probably seen in media recently, with maybe like the Equifax breach or other examples of people having their personal identity stolen, it's really hard to ensure confidentiality or to promise confidentiality. It's also difficult to measure emotional harm. So for instance, I do some telemental health stuff, and there's a lot that goes into like protecting or assessing for risks of safety with individuals who you're not face to face with. So doing things over the phone or via the internet, you can be really far away from somebody, and it can be a challenge to determine whether or not what you're doing is actually causing harm or causing emotional distress. And also issues of informed consent. Somebody might say that they're 18 over the internet, but they're not. So then you may or may not really be getting informed consent. There's a few other interesting considerations that I think for internet research, which might be beyond this course, but there was an example of researchers who put together like an online video game to determine how protein structure worked for HIV, which researchers weren't able to figure out for a really long time. But by putting it on an online game format and giving an army of gamers an opportunity to try to solve the riddle of how the proteins fold for HIV, they were able to find it in less than 24 hours. So, or I think within a couple days at least. So then who gets credit for the research? Is it the people that put the game together? Is it the people who put the study together? Is it the gamers? All interesting components that come into research using the internet. So just some guidelines for social work research. Guideline 1 is just to test ideas against empirical reality, but without being too invested in a specific result, because people who do have conflicts of interest and who really depend on a certain result for their career or for financial gains or whatever are more likely to act biased and skew their data. Also, plan and carry out investigations systematically. So it's a good idea to have colleagues to consult with and make sure that you're following all the steps that you need to in order to be systematic about your research and follow the professional guidelines of the field. Also, step 3 is document all procedures and disclose them publicly. Again, as I talked about publishing your data, the more accessible your study becomes, the more people in your field are able to criticize it, the less likely that you're having any kind of ethical dilemmas or that you would find people taking objection with your research. That's why the peer review process becomes so important as well. It's also important to clarify your assumptions and assumptions you made either statistically or about a certain population, and then specifying the meaning of all terms. So even in your literature review, it's a good idea to discuss the specific meaning of terms that you're using, as the reader may be unfamiliar, or maybe you're using a term that isn't so colloquial that most people would know what it was. It's good to specify what the term means and how you're using it. And just a few more standards here. I would say it's important to maintain a skeptical stance towards current knowledge, kind of question what you're seeing and if it's really true, and not just accepting somebody as an authority figure when really I think everybody's up to some level of criticism and critique. I would say it's also important to write up research in a way that it can be replicated by others. And just because something's done once with one population doesn't mean that it shouldn't be replicated with another population to see if it is really generalizable across the board. Again, a lot of research is done kind of like within a vacuum, where we try to minimize any kind of external influence so that we can really prove the relationship from one variable onto another. But without some kind of replication, we can't necessarily say that that's going to hold up in all circumstances. And then once we have our data, there's all kinds of different statistical things that we can do to look for regularities or patterns within our data. Specifically, the more data points we have, typically the more patterns kind of tend to arise out of that data that we can further investigate, further pull apart, and try to make sense of.